But when they came in, it was over 200, about 240,000, but they went up to over 400,000 because these were reserves.
Yeah.
So the combination was over
It was a
400,000.
serious army.
Yes, it was a very good army, very well trained, had lots of equipment. And when the Russians went in, they only actually had initially on the ground in Ukraine, in that part of Ukraine, only about 90,000 troops.
But what was Putin thinking at the time? I mean, he saw this serious buildup of an army, but then he comes in with an army of 100,000 soldiers. In a strange way, there was not first an air fight or something like that. He just went in and...
Listen, you're asking critical questions, and I'm sure we'll know the absolute facts, but let's back up and talk about what...
Did you understand?
Oh, yes, yeah, I do now. I did not at the time.
Okay.
Neither did the Russians. Okay, and we have to understand this. When he first went in, I think he thought this was his opportunity to signal to us how serious he was, as though we were going to suddenly change our approach and take him seriously. He completely misjudged this. Putin is someone that has always been of, major Russian figures, probably the single most Western-oriented or pro-Western leader of the bunch. Very much so.
Yeah, he lived in Germany for...
Yes, yeah, he did. You'd have to go back to the late 19th century, early 20th century to find Russian czars who had the kind of positive view of the West that he does, or did. And I think this was part of the problem. He assumed that we would react. Well, he didn't understand that our view of the Russians was completely skewed in favor of the Russians are weak, the Russians are corrupt, the Russians are stupid, the Russians are incapable. I mean, just go down the list. This is really what people in Washington thought. And I remember having conversations with some of them in these think tanks. And I tried to tell this one gentleman who's very prominent, you see him from time to time on YouTube and television. And I said, don't you understand? The Russian military is not the same as Western militaries. You may look at them and say, well, they don't seem to be quite as polished. They don't seem to be as well equipped or well fitted in their uniforms and so forth. Those things are superficial. The Russian army has always had this sort of loose-looking soldier. And it's always had large numbers of non-Russians with it. Units of Uzbeks and units of Chechens and others. This is not new.
Yeah, this is their history.
This is their history. I said, don't reach the wrong conclusions and don't assume that these people aren't going to fight for their country. Well, they're the ones who invaded. But from the standpoint of Putin, once he gets into Ukraine, what he thought was a problem is infinitely greater. Once they get into eastern Ukraine, not only do they find this monstrous Ukrainian army for which he was unprepared, he also finds the biolab.
But is the intelligence on both sides failing at the time?
Yeah, I think so. I think both sides misinterpreted and misread things. No question about it.
But how is that possible? Because there has always been a good relation between the Russian and the Ukrainians. He must have had spies or something like that.
Well, there's two things going on here. Yes, the Ukrainians and the Russians have cooperated and gotten along from time to time. They also haven't. And as we built this army up, we began essentially stoking the fires of the Second World War. Remember, an estimated 9 million Ukrainian lives, probably 2 more million Russians as well that never are mentioned, but 9 million Ukrainians were systematically murdered between 1929 and 1933. The man who did it was in the NKVD. His name was Yagoda, and he and his NKVD officers went in there after they'd emptied prisons inside Russia and brought convicts with them because the convicts could be relied upon to rape and murder and steal whatever they found, which is what they wanted to do. They were there to destroy what they said was the Ukrainian, what we would say is middle class, but in reality, these people took the opportunity to effectively destroy Ukraine.
Are you referring to the Holodomor?
Yes, yeah. And this also
the farmers.
Yeah, but there's a cultural...
This is the wound in Ukraine.
Oh, yeah, terrible. And this is one of the reasons why there were so many Ukrainians, and then later on many, many Russians as well, who went over to the Germans. This is something we don't talk about. But they began stoking these old fires. And there were always people in Western Ukraine who were enamored of National Socialism. And these symbols started showing up. And of course, this was done to aggravate the Russians on the one hand, but also to create the illusion that this was a new, superior army on the model of the German force.
You're referring to the Azov regiment.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of them.
And these things were funded by, at the time, Kolomoisky, who was Jewish. And remember, we had this man, Zelensky, who was Jewish. So you have the juxtaposition of, on the one hand, these symbols of hate and murder.
Even Nazism.
Yeah.
On the one hand.
Yeah, and all these Jews who are in prominent roles inside.
Yeah, but the interesting thing, of course, is how it's going to develop itself, because it became something different. Well, that's right. The great lesson, no, that's the problem. He thought we were approachable. He thought the people, especially in Berlin, he was shocked when Schultz shows up and spews this nonsense. It was a case of cognitive dissonance, as we say in English. He couldn't reconcile what the man was saying with reality. He said Schultz has joined this camp. Berlin is now in this camp that is violently anti-Russian, and we have no reason for the Germans to hate us. We've done and we've gotten along with the Germans. He just sort of, what is going on? He couldn't believe it. He was surprised. In fact, I wasn't surprised that this reaction was so fierce in the West. Maybe well, you live in the West. There has always been his association with the KGB. The assumption is that he's another NKVD thug, like Yoda in Ukraine. And that was absolutely not the case. The other thing is, and I had time when I was in graduate school to meet with defectors, many of whom were KGB agents or GRU people, and what you found from them was that they had traveled extensively outside of the Soviet Union. Yeah, they knew more about the West and had a very different view. They broadened the mind, and that was the case with Putin. He had lived outside the country, gotten to know Germany very well, liked the Germans, got along with the Germans, and he began to see the West as a potential partner. Remember, he raised the issue of, could Russia join NATO? Now, was this a serious proposal? I think it was very serious on his part. I think he was looking for an opportunity to integrate Russia into the West, but he's always had people around. Starts this thing, and he suddenly realizes the elephant is the enemy, not the friend. And then by June, his generals sit down with him and they said, look, if you're serious about this, we're going to have to change everything. Yeah, we're going to have to be prepared to fight for years. This is a large war of decision. And that's when he realizes this is an existential threat to Russia. This is not something we are prepared under any circumstances to lose. Now, he never thought that was possible anyway, because very prudently he said strategically, you want to fight me on my doorstep? You're pretty stupid. And he was right. But he grossly miscalculated initially. He thought he was dealing with a different set of leaders from what was actually there. And then he decides to change everything by the time you get to it's just south of Kiev, and there it was just a plain right up to the river on the border with Russia. And we said, go ahead and attack that. And the commander said to President Putin, let them have it. It doesn't matter right now. We need to consolidate our position, then we need to become impregnable. And when we've consolidated our position, our defenses are impregnable, then we launch offenses and we move out of them. Effectively a repetition of Kursk from the Russian standpoint, and the Ukrainians were then invited to do what? Attack. Yeah, and we were stupid enough to tell them to attack. And what the Russians have proven and demonstrated, something they understood since the 70s, was the criticality of linking all of the overhead space-based and terrestrial surveillance, unmanned and manned drones, satellites, everything with all of the standoff attack systems, rocket artillery, conventional artillery, tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, everything. And when that was linked, then we didn't seem to appreciate the lethality of that system. I call it in my book Margin of Victory, and previously in my book in 2003, Transformation Under Fire, I called it the ISR Strike Complex. And I said we have to integrate ground forces maneuver.